All set.
Good evening. I hope everyone is doing great on this day of Patriot Week. I appreciate you coming in and listening to this discussion about a very important raging debate that's been happening in our society. It's hard to keep track now with so many things happening all at once that this controversy even was important a couple of weeks ago, but it is one that's incredibly important in connection with the future direction of our country. And I appreciate you coming in at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to discuss this very important topic. And just so that you understand, what I will do is a overview of critical race theory versus the Declaration of Independence, kind of walk us through what critical race theory is and how that conflicts, I would say, and maybe not conflict with the Declaration of Independence, but I don't really think there is any place where it doesn't really conflict. And then I'll go through the Declaration of Independence, explain why that's my proposition, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you could just hold back on questions, and you can either send the questions in the comments, or we'll have you be able to talk and ask questions either visually or audibly at the end of my presentation. I really appreciate it. And for those of you that don't know, I am Judge Michael Warren from the Oakland County Circuit Court, former member of the State Board of Education, and co-creator with my then 10-year-old daughter, Leah, of Patriot Week. Of course, you're all here, so I suspect you know that you can learn about Patriot Week at patriotweek.org. But in case you're a guest that isn't familiar, I just suggest you go there and learn all about the week, and I can dive into the substance right away. The first thing I want to point out is that I believe in primary sources. I've always thought that's the best way to learn. So for those of you that have been listening to the Patriot Lessons, American History and Civics podcast, we've been doing a deep dive in the Declaration of Independence, literally sometimes word by word, or at least sentence by sentence or phrase by phrase, a very in-depth discussion of, and again, culling from not just the text of the Declaration itself, but from the Founding Fathers and others that put all that into context. And I'm going to adhere to that tradition by quoting the critical race theorists themselves. Most of this will come from a particular source, but I have reviewed many different sources, and they all echo what's in this source. And in fact, this seems to be the primary document that most people go to have a more of a layman's understanding or a laywoman's understanding of critical race theory. There are some law review articles, there's some esoteric kind of conversations here or there, but this will get us to the meat and guts of the controversy that has surrounded this issue. And the book that I've most heavily relied upon is called Critical Race Theory, An Introduction. It's edited by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik. It was published in 2001, although there is now a third edition, but this was the first one that was published. And I think true to the heart and spirit of what critical race theory is all about. Richard and Jean were, especially Richard, was kind of on the ground level of creating critical race theory. So as a former debater and a historian of sorts, I do believe that we should go back to those people that established it and to determine what they intended, and try to get past any kind of charged rhetoric in connection with their beliefs. And then we can evaluate it for what they propose critical race theory is. I'll start with very quickly just saying, when did it start? It started actually back in the mid-1970s. It developed as the civil rights movement was perceived to be stalling out by those that are more, that were unsatisfied with progress beyond what happened in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. Richard Delgado was there at the beginning. He's the co-editor of the book. And from the book itself, it says, key is to its beginning was Delgado, who is the co-editor of this book, plus Derek Bell and Alan Freeman. If you look at some other sources, there's a few other names that are tossed in there, but this is kind of the holy trinity of the development of critical race theory. They had a conference in Wisconsin at a convent of all places, just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, which is very appropriate, in 1989. And so the question then becomes, well, what is it? And here's a quote directly from the first page of this book. Remember, this is the introduction. So this is the introduction to the book of the Introduction to Critical Race Theory. Quote, the critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and even feelings and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law, unquote. So let's unpack that for a minute. They admit that they are activists and scholars. They're interested about race, racism, and power. And they have given up on the idea of the kind of the march of progress, which most Americans, I think, have embraced, which includes that we started off with the Declaration of Independence, declaring all men are created equal, that was seen to be hypocritical, that there were slaves and women were disempowered and other ethnic groups were disenfranchised, and religious groups, even white men who didn't own property. But over the course of many years of struggle, generational change, the Civil War, civil rights struggles, amendments to the Constitution, we have been trying our slowly but surely to better fulfill the promise of equality in the Declaration of Independence through the Constitution and other civil rights legislation. And that quote just said, that would be considered incrementalism, right? Step-by-step progress. They reject that. They say, no, we don't want step-by-step progress. It questions the foundations of the liberal order. And they don't mean liberal in the sense of liberal Democrats or liberal Republicans versus conservative Republicans or conservative Democrats. They mean what we consider classical liberalism, those foundations which are built into the Declaration of Independence and embodied in the Constitution. As I will talk about later, those would be the rule of law, unalienable rights, limited government, the social compact, equality, and the right to alter or abolish an oppressive government. Those are the foundation stones of the classical liberal order, along with free market competition, private ownership of property, which falls within unalienable rights, those kinds of things, a fair and impartial judiciary, an attempt to discern the law, not make it by the judiciary, the division of powers through the separation of powers and checks and balances, all that. That's what we would consider to be the liberal order. They reject that, and it specifically says, including equality theory. Equality theory would be, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They're saying, no, we do not believe in that. Legal reasoning, the idea that you will come to a decision about the law based on the facts before the court, the arguments of the parties, legal precedent that exists, statutory provisions and constitutional provisions, if they apply, that you have a fair and impartial decision maker, be that a jury or be that a judge. Parties present their arguments, and then rulings of law are made based on those facts and circumstances in the law. That's legal reasoning. Doesn't mean that everything is fixed and that the law never changes or evolves, but there's reasoning behind it. They have rejected that. Enlightenment rationalism is the idea that we have an ability to determine the truth and a scientific method, and to discern what social policies should be enacted by reason and by open discussion and debate, by experimentation. We have people like Thomas Jefferson and others that would be considered to be the embodiment of Enlightenment rationalism. They reject that. And neutral principles of constitutional law, which they also say they reject, questions the very foundations, is how they put it. Constitutional law is that the Constitution is written in a text. that there's historical circumstances surrounding it which inform what that text meant, that the parties can argue over the meaning of the text. Some believe more in trying to interpret the text based on what it meant at the time it was adopted. Others say, no, there's more of a spirit behind the text, and we can evolve as circumstances change. That would be the living constitution theory, and there's many different variations of both of those, but they're neutral principles, that you shouldn't make decisions based on your gut, or just because you want a certain decision, or because of the particular parties that are involved. Bias and prejudice should be thrown out. You should have neutrality, and neutral principles determine constitutional law. They question that. And that's page 1 of the introduction. Another quote from the introduction, this is page 3. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, controversies over curriculum and history, and IQ, and achievement testing. Political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theories. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. It sets out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better, unquote. That was a long quote, but I think it's an important one. Again, it recognizes that they are activists, that they're not just academic scholars like a sociologist or a psychologist or a historian or a political scientist that's trying to figure out what has happened, try to be fair and neutral, and teach that to others. They intend to transform society. That's exactly what they said, to transform it for the better. And there has been a lot of controversy recently about critical race theory, about how it's kind of a straw man presented by the right to attack the Democrats, or progressives, and to use it to raise money and other items like that. And the reality is that they admit right here, and this is back in 2001, so this is well before, that was 20 years ago, that it's throughout, or at least many in the field of education consider themselves to be critical race theorists, and they use it for a lot of things: school discipline, tracking, controversies over curriculum, how to teach history, intelligence test, and achievement testing. And there's been this movement to get away from standardized testing like the SAT and the LSAT and the various GRE, other standardized tests, because the outcomes have not been particularly helpful for some religious and, well, actually ethnic minorities. And you can see that this criticism started, or at least was bolstered by CRT. They are going right at the heart of education. And just as an aside, before I continue, the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the country, issued a statement which was very kind of at odds with itself. It basically said, critical race theory isn't being taught, and by the way, it needs to be taught, and we support it. So it was very confusing, and you'll hear that from those that are trying to defend critical race theory. First, they say it's not being taught; it's a right-wing conspiracy, and then they defend it and explain why it's so important to have it. I don't know how that really jives. Either you should say it's not being taught and it's silly, or it should be taught, and here's why. They're trying to have their cake and eat it too, I would think. They also continue and say that it was based on critical legal studies and radical feminism. So I'm going to quote, and this is from page 27 of the book. From critical legal studies came the idea that legal cases do not have correct outcomes, but is determined based on what side ends up winning because of a variety of circumstances. So I want to break that down. That attacks this idea of a neutral decision-making based on law that's already been made, in which the parties bring facts before a neutral judge or a jury that make a decision. And once you find out all the facts and circumstances, figure out who's the credible person, figure out what actually happened, what law should apply. In theory, you should have consistent results. There is a neutral outcome that should arise from those circumstances. Now, if you get a different jury or different facts are presented, or somebody evaluates the law differently, you might have varying outcomes, but the idea is that you should have a neutral outcome. And here they reject that. They say, no, there really is no, legal cases are done for other reasons. And it's really a power dynamic. They don't say that here, but they say at other places that, whoever is in charge will win the case because they have the power to make sure that the outcome that they desire happens. That's their theory. The book continues still on the same page. From radical feminism, the CRT took insights into the relationship between power and the construction of social roles, as well as unseen, largely invisible collection of patterns and habits that make up patriarchy and other types of domination, unquote. So that basically says that our society is structured in a way based on the arbitrary collection of power, or maybe not arbitrary, it's based on race dynamics, where the majority is oppressing the minority, and it's invisible. It's through patterns and habits. You really don't see it. It's not so blatant as, for example, in the past where we had slavery, or where we had Jim Crow, or where we had redlining, where African-American families couldn't move into an area, neighborhood, or Japanese Americans were interned. Those are blatant. They're saying, no, it's underneath that. It's largely invisible. They also pull from, quote, from conventional civil rights thought, the movement took a concern for redressing historic wrongs, as well as the insistence that legal and social theory have practical consequences. CRT also shared with it a sympathetic understanding of notions of nationalism and group empowerment, unquote. So from the civil rights movements of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the early 70s, they say we should address historic wrongs. It's a little different than the 1619 Project, which says that we're irredeemable because of what happened back in 1619. They do think that we can redress historic wrongs, and that the law and social theory should be used in their activist way to change society. This idea about a sympathetic understanding of notions of nationalism and group empowerment, when you read it, it's not nationalism in the sense that we're all Americans and we should unite together and defend America from the challenges of communism or fascism, Japanese imperialism, or Islamic terrorists. It's nationalism within subgroups within the country. So Black nationalism, or Japanese nationalism, or indigenous peoples nationalism. They support empowering those people to come together and to challenge the existing hierarchy. There are several basic tenets, but I'm going to pull out 5 which are really important to their ideology. And one is that racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational. The usual way society does business, the common everyday experience in most people of color in this country. That's a direct quote. So racism is not, it's not a couple of bad apples. It's not a few people here and there. It's the whole society is racist, or at least the whites are racist. And they explain a little bit that it's not necessarily each individual is racist, but the whole way society is developed and instituted is racist. It's very much like Marxism, in that there was, the proletariat were being oppressed by the bourgeoisie, that, a particular person of the bourgeoisie might be a good person, might treat his neighbors well, might give a charitable donations, all that stuff. But the whole superstructure of the class dynamic meant that the society was evil and needed to have a proletariat revolution. Very similar way that they're explaining here. Racism is embedded within the society. And that is very much like the 1619 Project. Tenet number 2 is, quote, white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, unquote. So a little wonky there, but basically what they're saying is the whites dominate, they're in charge, they're on top of the society, and to say anything opposite of that is to be ignorant of what's really happening. And so, for example, this idea of a colorblind society, they do not want that. They do not believe that because it only addresses obvious forms of racism, like I mentioned before, redlining, Jim Crow, that kind of thing. They, the CRT theorists, believe in interest convergence or material determinism. Those are some, again, wonky terms, but basically that whites benefit from the racist society, both materially because there's more money that the whites have, and psychologically that large, because they feel that they're superior to minorities, and therefore psychologically they're boasted up. And the analogy here would be, or maybe it's the evolution of this, is back when slavery existed down in the South. Most people did not own slaves, but they felt like they were superior to any African American because of the society, and therefore they would fight for the institution, even if they didn't directly benefit from it, because psychologically they benefited from it. So that was another component of their tenets here. The third tenet of CRT is the, quote, social construction, unquote, thesis. And the social construction thesis is very interesting. Quote, race and races are products of social thought and relations, not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetic reality. Rather, races are categories that society invents, manipulates, or retires when convenient. People with common origins share certain physical traits, of course, such as skin color, physique, and hair texture, but these constitute only an extremely small portion of their genetic endowment, are dwarfed by that which we have in common, and have little or nothing to do with distinctly human, higher order traits such as personality, intelligence, and moral behavior, unquote. Again, that was a little wonky. That basically they say there's no differences in people. People are all people, they're all human, and that race is developed by the oppressors, the people that have less pigment in their skin, to oppress others. It's a social construct. This is probably the only point that the Declaration of Independence and CRT agree, because the Declaration of Independence and our beliefs underneath it are that all people are created equal, right? That we're all children of God, created by the Creator. We have unalienable rights in us. Doesn't matter our skin color, our gender, our ethnic group, our past family, or any of that stuff. We're all children of God, and we should all be treated equally. The twist here on CRT is that they're using it to show that the society is unjust because there are these inequalities within the system. The fourth tenet is, quote, intersectionality and anti-essentialism, unquote. And basically this idea is that every person isn't just a Black or a white, a Japanese or Filipino or Latino. They could be white and Jewish, or they could be working class and a single mother. They could be an African American but be gay or lesbian. A Latino may be a Republican, or maybe even a Black Latino if they came from the Caribbean. An Asian may be a Hmong of rural background and unfamiliar with mercantile life, or a fourth generation Chinese whose father is a university professor and a mother who operates a business. So there's all these different ways of identifying who you are. And they call that intersectionality. And so their critique, I suppose there's truth to this, right? We're all, I mean, again, going back to Declaration of Independence, we're all children of God. We're all unique and have a divine spark in us and should be treated with great respect. And they say this is the problem that flows from intersectionality. Quote, ignoring the problem of intersectionality as liberalism often does, remember liberalism in the sense of the classical West, risks doing things by half measures and leaving major sectors of the population dissatisfied. Classical liberalism also has been criticized as overly caught up in the search for universals, such as admissions standards for universities or sentencing guidelines that are the same for all. The CRTs, they call them crits here. The crits point out that this approach is apt to do injustice to individuals who experience and situations differ from the norm. They call for individualized treatment, quote, context that pays attention to minority lives instead. This deficiency is apt to be particularly glaring in the case of double minorities, such as Black women or gay Black men, whose lives are twice removed from the experience of mainstream Americans. So this idea that we mentioned earlier about being neutral, applying the law with neutrality, coming to an outcome that's based on the law and the circumstances, they say, no, that's not fair. We need to have, we need to recognize intersectionality. And so outcomes should be different. If you're a privileged white rich guy and you commit crime A, and you're an African-American lesbian poor person, you might commit the same crime, and we should hammer the white guy and not the African-American. That's what they're basically driving at. And based on identity, not based on facts, circumstances, all those other things. The fifth tenet they have is, quote, a unique voice of color, unquote. And this very much relates to intersectionality. Quote, coexisting somewhat uneven tension with anti-essentialism, which is intersectionality. The voice of color thesis holds that because of their different histories and experiences with oppression, Black, Indian, Asian, or Latino writers and thinkers may be able to communicate to their white counterparts matters that the whites are unlikely to know. Minority status, in other words, brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. So when they talk about this, they again entirely reject neutrality and color blindness. They say, quote, only aggressive color conscious efforts to change the way things are will do much to ameliorate misery, unquote. And they say basically everything else is window dressing. And in this, they also challenge the idea of rights at all. Quote, crits are also highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights, particularly some of the older, more radical CRT scholars with roots in racial realism and an economic view of history believe that moral and legal rights are apt to do the right holder much less good than they would like to think. And then they give some examples about how, free speech rights, for example, because they defend hate speech, means that, the people that usually get hate speech are racial minorities. And therefore, even though it's supposedly neutral, it really isn't, because it supports the white hierarchy, not racial minorities. And they go through a couple of other examples about that. They also say, and this is really interesting, that Brown, but at least some of them attack Brown versus Board of Education because they say it made the whites feel good that they passed Brown versus, the Supreme Court passed Brown versus Board of Education, struck down racially segregated schools, but it really hasn't done anything for racial minorities. And in fact, they support the idea of having minority schools because they think that would lead to a better educational outcome. They also throw in white privilege, which refers to the myriad of social advantages, benefits, and courtesies that come along with being a member of the dominant race. And they refer to people that have listed like 50 different things that enable whites to be treated better because of their race. And they also embrace the idea of microaggressions, which you've probably heard about, which is not blatant racism, but you don't act in a way that might be courteous to one person based on the race as opposed to another, or you might say something that's unknowingly offensive, or you don't care if it's offensive, and that kind of goes together. They attack the idea of merit, saying that merit really is just perpetuating the white hierarchy. and oppression, because it's caked in because of microaggressions and everything else, the intersectionality and all this stuff, that it's always going to be to a disadvantage of African Americans. They like to use storytelling. This was kind of interesting. I had no idea about this, to advocate for their position. So they don't look at data. And I mean, I read this whole book. There's very little about statistics, which I think you could build some statistics to support some of their argument. They don't bother. They tell an anecdote. They seem to be fictional, although if they're, I apologize if they're not, but they don't like cite anything that says this actually happened. But they'll say, you know, imagine a circumstance where a white person goes in here and then a black person goes in here, or a Japanese person goes in here, and they're treated differently. This proves the theory and the thesis of critical race theory. So they're not data driven. They like to tell the stories. The ABA, the American Bar Association, I went on their website just to see what they thought about it. And they don't quite come out and say that they endorse CRT, but there's a big web page on it, and it explains it. And I want to quote what their, and this is from a Human Rights Magazine, Home, Civil Rights, Reimagining the Policy, Policing, and it's a lesson on critical race theory. So they've put it out there for people to use, although I didn't find a resolution on it. I couldn't find the National Education Association resolution on it either, because they took it off their website, but there are articles about it where they report that they support critical race theory. But going back to the ABA, it says, quote, rejection of popular understandings about racism, such as arguments that confine racism to a few bad apples. That's what CRT is doing. CRT recognizes that racism is codified in law, embedded in structures, and woven into public policy. CRT rejects claims of meritocracy or colorblindness. CRT recognizes that it is the systematic nature of racism that bears primary responsibility for reproducing racial inequality. Now compare this to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to establish new government, laying its foundation such principles and organized power such forms of them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So from that declaration, and if you read the rest, you'll see that quite evidently. There's 6 founding first principles. One is the rule of law, that the law should govern not individuals and the personal predilections of those that happen to be in power at the time. So that means that the law is passed, everyone knows it, everyone is supposed to adhere to it, from the richest person, you know, Bill Gates, to the janitor or somebody on food stamps, from the judge to the prisoner, from the CEO to the customer, to, you know, a lowly janitor, whatever it is. The law should apply the same to everyone, regardless of your money, your family background, your race, your religion, your ethnic background. If you've been in the country one day versus you came over on the Mayflower, doesn't matter. They reject that, right? They say that the rule of law is an instrumentality of white oppression. We should not apply neutral principles. We should change outcomes based on who's before the court. And so they very much are subversive to the rule of law. They don't say that we should eliminate all law. They want to use it as an instrumentality for activism. They reject the major premises of the rule of law, which is equality and application to all. So the rule of law, unalienable rights. Now, I read earlier, they reject this idea of rights. Unalienable rights means that nature and nature's God has endowed you when you're born with certain rights that cannot be taken away without your consent. And we like to think of those as free speech, freedom of press, free exercise of religion. And there's many others that if you think about, you know, the right to get married, the right to travel, that may not be articulated in the Bill of Rights or elsewhere in the Constitution, be treated fairly by the government authorities. not to allow the government to break into your house and take things without a warrant. Those are unalienable rights, natural rights, which come to you just by being a person. And they reject the rights philosophy. They think it perpetuates the status quo in white privilege and all the hierarchy of the existing social class. So they want to get rid of it. They don't recognize it. And they want to, instead, they believe everything is based on power and that we need to change the power dynamic so that more just outcomes can happen. So we have the rule of law and animal rights, limited government. This is the idea that the government has only so much authority. It's in the federal government, it's called enumerated powers. We list out the powers that the federal government has. In the state governments, their constitutions list out the powers and authority that they have. If it's not within the authority, they shouldn't do it. It's illegal, it's unconstitutional. Then we chop power up between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And we chop up power between the federal government and the state governments. And each state government is supreme in its realm, and the federal government is supreme in its realm. And they don't really talk too much about limited government versus unlimited government, but it's pretty clear that they kind of look past the fact that there's limited government, and what they really want to do is use government to change society, to eliminate the white patriarchy and it would be a the white dominant system and the patriarchy, and to reorder society, which would be much beyond the purpose of government, because governments are instituted to protect the unalienable rights of people. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. But here they don't really talk about the origin of government. They just want to use it not to protect rights because they don't believe in rights, but to effectuate the changes that they want in society. So we have rule of law and animal rights, limited government, the social compact. And this they clearly reject. They don't even contemplate that it could possibly be true. And the idea of the social compact is that in a state of nature, people live in the Hobbesian nightmare without a government. You have to protect yourself. Your life is nasty, short, and brutish because you're always on the defensive. You have to make sure that you're protecting your property, your family, your life, your liberty. And so instead of living in that kind of society, we've come together to create a government. We've given the government some authority to protect our life's liberty and property and other unalienable rights. And then the government has an obligation to follow the basic charter of government. So they have a duty to follow the Constitution and their laws. And it's designed, again, to protect our rights. They believe that the social compact, that there is no social compact, that it's, again, a white supremacist society that's imposed on the minorities and is, that's the purpose of the government, is to support racial oppression. And so there's a very significant turning upside down of what the idea of government is, the purpose of government. So we have unalienable rights, limited government, social compact, equality. It's probably the biggest one, which is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We obviously did that in a hypocritical breach of how we've moved forward. But they, critical race theorists reject that idea of equality. They say it's a social construct, and that intersectionality is how you define people, and that we're not all the same under God or the creator or nature and nature's law. We're all individually different, and that we need outcomes in society based on our differences. So that's inequality. And then the other is the idea of altering or abolishing an oppressive government. And we have tried that through both the American Revolution, but also through the adoption of the Constitution and then amending the Constitution to back up or to remedy its glaring flaws that have existed over the years. They have rejected incrementalism. So I suppose both the Declaration and critical race theorists believe that you should change society, no question about it, for a better end. The founders and the Declaration say if you have a long chain of abuse and usurpations, and they list out a whole slew of them, and it shows that there is an invariable intent to oppress your rights, you have the authority and right, natural right, unalienable right to overthrow the government. If not, then you should do it in peaceful means, either by amending the Constitution, changing the law, electing different people to government post, whatever it is, but that it should be really a last resort to have a revolution. CRT never comes out and says there ought to be a revolution of the minority to overthrow the white supremacist. I haven't seen that. There are people that wrote that way in the 60s and 70s. I don't see that, but they reject incrementalism. And what's the opposite of, if they reject that, then there must be something. So they definitely want a radical change. I will say this, if you buy the CRT arguments, then you could say that the Declaration of Independence, last resort of revolution, would be appropriate. So you have to decide, on the merits, is CRT right, that every time there apparently is progress is just another way to oppress the people, or are we really making progress? They'd never joined. Now, this is 2001, so I don't know if they've changed it in their newer book, their third edition, which I think is 2017. They never actually join any of the counter arguments, really. So I don't know how they would feel about the fact that President Barack Obama was elected, or that there's lots of people that are very successful that are African Americans and other minorities, if they think that's all window dressing or if they think that's progress. Because although they reject incrementalism, they also believe that you can make progress. So it's very fuzzy there about how they would view that. But there clearly is a clash. And there are schools that are obviously teaching it, despite their, in K through 12 schools, despite the protests to the contrary. That just seems to be an attempt to evade the reality. And with that, I will open it up for any questions. Can ask either by the chat or raise your hand, or if you think you learned everything there is to learn about CRT and the Declaration of Independence, I'll let you guys go. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate you coming here and watching this session. Oh, okay, we got one from Bob Ranke. Is CRT then unconstitutional? Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that CRT, it's kind of like asking, is Marxism unconstitutional? The fact that you believe in it is, that would be protected through the freedom of speech and freedom of press. If they implemented everything that they're talking about, it would have to tear down large portions of the constitutional order, because it's flipping on its head so much, like we have in the 14th Amendment. Everyone is supposed to have the equal protection of law. Well, they don't believe in that. So we would need to, that if they implemented that, we'd have to, take a black marker and strike that out. They don't believe in rights. So you'd have to cross out the Bill of Rights and every other protection that exists. So it would, if it was implemented, it would be unconstitutional, or the Constitution have to be radically revised to allow it to be implemented. Good question. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? All right. Well, I want to thank you very much. I hope you learned something. I know I did when I started doing the research, and it's an issue that is not leaving us anytime soon. There is a big push for the CRT in our K through 12 schools, as well as in the academy and higher education. And so I encourage you to use the knowledge you have today to protect our founding first principles and preserve the Republic. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all very much.